The only sound in the ghost boat saloon was the brittle crack of Elara Vance's knuckles as she squeezed the handle of her carpet bag, a sound like tiny bones breaking. The saloon wasn't on a riverfront or a dusty street. It was a rotting, repurposed sternwheel steamer, the River Maiden, beached decades ago on a desolate mudflat 20 miles from the actual Rio Grande. The air inside was a stagnant soup of mildew, cheap whiskey, and the ghost of old river water. Elara, 30, and with the wary stillness of a woman who'd learned to measure distances, geographic and emotional, stood just inside the doorway. Her gray travel dress already speckled with the fine alkali dust of the journey. The men at the crude plank bar, trappers, fugitives, and broken prospectors, turned as one. Their gazes were not welcoming, but calculating, like crows eyeing something shiny and out of place. "You're early, Mrs. Vance," a voice rasped from the shadowed faro table. The man who rose was Silas Rook, the reason she was here. He was cadaverously thin, with fingers stained nicotine yellow and eyes the color of a winter puddle. He was a broker of peculiarities, and she was a procurer of the same. Her late husband's cartography business had folded, but his contacts, men who sought rare maps, unusual fossils, ethnographic artifacts, remained. She'd become the discreet middlewoman for a certain class of collector. And Silas had the most peculiar commission yet. "The stage made good time," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the chill that had settled in her spine upon seeing this place. She approached his table, ignoring the other's stares. "You said you had a location." "A verified one." "I do," Silas smiled, a thin crack in his weathered face. He slid a whiskey bottle and a single tin cup toward her. She ignored it. "A cave. Not in some sun-blasted canyon. In the salt. The white wastes. My source says it's not just a burial site. It's a library. Of sorts. Bones arranged in patterns, telling stories. Tools made from mammoth ivory and obsidian, undisturbed. A snapshot of a people who walked this land when it was all ice and giant beasts." His eyes gleamed with avarice. "Your Boston gentleman will pay a fortune for a crate of that. Enough to set you up proper, away from all this." Elara's mind, trained to see patterns and contour lines in ethnographic detail, recoiled at the vision of plundering such a place. Yet, the sum he mentioned was staggering. It was escape. It was a future not reliant on the ghost of her husband or the leering suspicion of men like these. "Your source?" "Outside." Silas nodded toward a greasy window. "A half-breed who stumbled on it after a skirmish with Comancaro. He's the only guide who can take you there. For a percentage, of course." She followed him out of the saloon's oppressive gloom into the flat, white glare of the mud flat. The landscape was surreal, a cracked, endless pan of dried lake bed, glittering with salt crystals that stretched to a hazy, heat-shimmered horizon. It looked less like the west and more like the surface of a dead moon. And there, leaning against a twisted, salt-bleached snag of juniper, was him. He was Apache. But his attire was a mosaic of survival: patched cavalry trousers, a faded calico shirt under a long, well-oiled leather apron like a blacksmith might wear, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. A heavy pack and a long, octagonal-barreled rifle rested against the wood beside him. He wasn't looking at them, but scanning the white expanse with an intensity that suggested he was reading a hidden text in its blankness. "This is him," Silas said, with a tone of distaste. "Calls himself Kolenya. Speaks English. Knows the wastes like the back of his hand." At the sound of his name, the man turned. He pushed his hat back slightly. His face was all planes and angles, etched by sun and wind, but it was his eyes that arrested her. They were a striking, light hazel, almost gold, an anomaly she'd never seen or heard of among the Apache. They held no warmth, only a deep, untamed intelligence and a simmering impatience. "This is the woman?" Kolenya's voice was low, graveled by disuse, his English precise. He looked her up and down, his gaze missing nothing. The sensible boots, the worn but clean dress, the quiet defiance in her posture. "The wastes will eat her in 2 days." "She's tougher than she looks," Silas chuckled. Without conviction. "I do not guide for pay," Kolenya said, addressing Elara directly, ignoring Silas completely. "I guide for a trade." "You document. You make pictures with your camera?" He gestured to the large box camera case a porter had set beside her bag. "I make photographic plates." "Yes," she said, meeting his strange golden gaze. "For the artifacts." A faint grim smile touched his lips. "Not for the artifacts. For the stories. The bones tell stories. My people's stories and the stories of the ones who came before, the old ones. Your box of chemicals and glass can capture what they say better than a pencil or a thief's greedy hands. You make the pictures for me. I get copies. You can take your trinkets for your paymaster back east. That is the trade." Silas spluttered. "Now see here, that wasn't the arrangement. You get a cut of the sale." Kolenya's eyes flicked to Silas, and the temperature seemed to drop. "The arrangement is with her, or there is no guide. The wastes have 1,000 ways to be lost forever. You would not find your way back to this rotten boat." Elara's mind raced. This was not what she'd signed on for. Yet there was a fierce, magnetic integrity to this man. He wasn't a mercenary. He was an archivist of a dying world, using the only tool offered to him, her. The ethical knot in her stomach loosened, just a fraction. She would still be taking things, but she would also be preserving something. It was a compromise with her own conscience. "I agreed to your terms," she said, before Silas could object further. "I will make duplicate plates for you of everything we document in situ." Kolenya gave a single, slow nod. "We leave in 1 hour." The sun does not forgive hesitation. He turned and began methodically checking the straps on his pack. Silas pulled Elara aside, his breath foul with whiskey. "You watch him, you hear? Those eyes. They ain't natural. He's got a reputation. They say he lived alone out there for years. That he knows things. Talks to the spirits of the salt. He's useful, but he's not right." An hour later, under the punishing zenith sun, they set out. Kolenya led, his stride eating up the distance across the cracked plain. Elara followed, her own smaller pack heavy with equipment, her skirts already coated in white powder. The river maiden shrank behind them, a bizarre, decaying silhouette in the immense nothingness. They walked in silence for miles. The world was eerily hushed, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on salt crust and the mournful whine of the wind through distant, jagged salt formations that rose like crumbling castles. The heat was a physical weight, but it was a dry, sucking heat that leached the moisture from her very thoughts as the sun began its descent, painting the white world in lurid pinks and oranges. Kolenya stopped near one of the larger salt formations. "We camp here. The night cold comes fast." While he built a small, efficient fire of precious juniper roots he'd carried, Elara dared to speak. "Your eyes. I've never seen that color among your people." He didn't look up from the kindling. "My mother was NDE acute. My father was a Welsh geologist who came to map the copper veins. He died of fever when I was small. My mother's people raised me, but I was always apart. The can't see, the golden-eyed one. It is not a blessing. It marks me as belonging to neither world." He lit the fire with a flint and steel. "Your husband, the map maker. He is gone?" The question was direct, unpitying. "Yes, 2 years cholera. And now you map the dead for the living," he observed, handing her a strip of dried venison. "This cave we seek. It is not just a tomb. It is a place of remembering. The bones are laid in the patterns of the stars as they were long ago. They tell of the great herds, of the ice rivers, of the first fire. Your people would call it a grave. My people would call it a school." His golden eyes fixed on hers in the flickering light. "You will feel it when we enter. The weight of all those years. It will ask you what you are doing there." The vast white silence of the wastes pressed in around their tiny island of firelight. Elara felt a profound isolation, but for the first time since her husband's death, it was a shared isolation. She was not just a widow on a grim errand. She was a scribe entering a forbidden archive with its last fierce guardian. And he was not just a guide. He was a man straddling two eroding worlds, trying to salvage a memory before the wind of time scoured it all away. Down to the bare, white bone. "I suppose I'll have to answer," she said softly. More to herself than to him, Kolenya watched the salt crystals glitter in the firelight like a field of fallen stars. "Yes," he murmured. "We both will." Dawn in the white wastes was not a gentle affair. It was a sudden, searing flood of light that erased shadows and turned the salt pan into a blinding, featureless plain. Kolenya moved before first light, his form a dark ghost against the gray pre-dawn, extinguishing their meager fire and packing with an efficiency that spoke of a life lived on the edge of readiness. Elara's body ached from the unyielding ground and the cold that had seeped into her bones, a cold so profound it felt baked into the very salt. She packed her own gear, her fingers stiff. The heavy glass plate boxes a familiar, punishing weight. "We walk in the low light," Kolenya said, handing her a strip of cloth soaked in water from his canteen. "Tie this over your eyes, under your hat. The salt blindness comes quick. It steals your vision and then your mind." She did as instructed, the world narrowing to a slit of less painful white. They set out, their path now weaving between the increasingly fantastical salt formations towers, bridges and fragile, lace-like walls sculpted by millennia of wind. It was a silent, mineral forest. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps and the occasional eerie groan of a shifting salt spire. After 3 hours, Kolenya halted at the base of what appeared to be a solid, sloping wall of dirty white. He unslung his rifle and used the butt to tap carefully at the salt. A hollow, resonant thump answered, different from the solid clicks around it. "It is here," he said, his voice hushed, not out of reverence, but practicality. Sound carried strangely here. The entrance sealed itself with a fall long ago. We open it, but with care. The ceiling inside is a dome of crystal salt. A shout can bring it down. He set to work with a small pick from his pack, not hacking, but probing and levering. Chunks of hardened salt clattered away. Slowly, a darker patch appeared, an opening no taller than a man's shoulder. A breath of air sighed out from the darkness, carrying a scent that made Elara's nose wrinkle. Ancient dust. Minerals and something else, faint and organic. Like old parchment and dried flowers. Kolenya lit a bullseye lantern, the beam cutting a sharp cone into the gloom. "You first with the light," he instructed her. "I will bring your cases. Move slowly. Do not touch the walls." Elara ducked through the opening, the lantern's beam trembling in her hand. The tunnel descended sharply for a few yards, the walls transitioning from rough salt to smooth, polished curves that glittered with embedded crystals. Then it opened, and her breath caught in a gasp that she stifled instantly, remembering his warning. It was a cathedral. A vast domed cavern, perhaps 100 feet across. The ceiling was indeed a breathtaking mosaic of massive salt crystals, some as large as wagon wheels, catching and refracting the lantern light into 1,000 scattered, dancing specks that swam across the walls like aquatic spirits. But it was the floor that held her transfixed, her professional detachment crumbling into awe. Bones. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, laid out in intricate, concentric patterns across the cavern floor. They were not piled haphazardly, but arranged with deliberate, breathtaking artistry. Long mammoth tusks formed great sweeping arches. Skulls of ancient bison were set in spirals that mirrored the galaxy of crystals above. Delicate ribs of pronghorn and horse were interwoven into complex geometric lattice. In the very center, a single perfect human skeleton lay extended, not in death, but in offering. Its bony hands clasped over a bundle of fossilized reeds and obsidian spear points. "The school of long memory," Kolenya whispered, entering behind her. His voice, even at that low volume, held a vibration of emotion she hadn't heard before. In the ethereal light, his golden eyes seemed to absorb the glow, making them luminous. "My grandfather's grandfather was brought here as a boy. The keepers then were old men who remembered the songs for each pattern. Now the songs are gone. Only the bones remain to speak." Elara set the lantern down on a natural salt plinth, her hands moving on instinct. She unpacked her camera, her fingers flying with a new urgency. This wasn't a commission for Silas Rook anymore. This was a communion. She set up the tripod, her mind already calculating exposures in the tricky, refracted light. "Start with the center," Kolenya said, not as an order, but as a guide. "The storyteller. Then the star spiral to the east. Each pattern is a chapter, a hunt, a migration, a treaty with the Wolfkind." She worked for hours in a silent, shared trance. The magnesium flash powder created miniature, silent thunderstorms in the cavern, each blast of light freezing a millennia-old tableau onto her glass plates. The chemical smoke mixed with the ancient air. Kolenya did not hover. He moved quietly along the edges, sometimes tracing a pattern in the salt dust with a fingertip, his lips moving silently. He was remembering, or trying to. During a pause as she switched plate holders, he spoke, his back to her. "The man you work for, Rook, he would have had men with sledgehammers and gunny sacks. They would have taken the tusks, the skulls that looked impressive, smashed the rest for trinkets. They would not have seen the story, only the coin." "I know," Elara said, the guilt a sharpstone in her gut. "That's why your trade is a good one. These plates, they'll last longer than the bones if kept safe. They are a true record." He turned, his face unreadable in the chiaroscuro of lantern and shadow. "You believe that? That your machine's eye is truer than the memory in blood and song? It's different," she conceded, wiping developer stains from her fingers with a cloth. "It's all I have to offer." A faint, almost imperceptible nod. "It is more than most would offer." As the day's outside light began to fade, signaled only by a subtle dimming of the refracted sparkles above, Elara prepared her final plate. It was a wide shot of the entire cavern from the entrance tunnel. Kolenya stood to the side, a part of the scene but not of the ancient story, a bridge between epochs. Just as she was about to squeeze the bulb, a low, deep rumble vibrated through the salt. A fine shower of crystalline dust drifted from the ceiling. They froze. "What was that?" She breathed, her heart hammering. Kolenya's head was cocked, every sense straining. "Not thunder. The wastes do not have storms like that." The rumble came again, closer, a grinding, mechanical sound utterly alien to this silent world. Then, faint but unmistakable, the sharp report of a rifle shot echoed by two more. "Rook," Kolenya spat the name. "He followed. Or had us followed. He does not trust trades, only takings." Panic surged in Elara. "He can't find this place." "He has found us," Kolenya said, already moving with lethal speed. He blew out the lantern, plunging them into a darkness so absolute it felt solid. The shots are a direction. They are lost, firing at shadows or mirages. But they will see our tracks. We have minutes. In the blackness, his hand found her arm, his grip absolute. The plates. Leave the camera. Just the plates. She fumbled in the dark, her trained hands finding the wooden box that held the exposed plates. She clutched it to her chest. She felt him guide her, not back toward the entrance, but deeper into the cavern around the perimeter of the bone mosaic. His other hand felt along the wall until he found a gap she had never noticed. There is a back way. A crawl. It leads to a crack on the other side of the formation. Do not speak. Do not make a sound. He pushed her gently into the narrower darkness. The air was colder, tighter. She shuffled forward, the box of plates scraping against the salt wall. Behind her, she could hear Kolenya piling loose salt rubble into the mouth of the tunnel. A faint, scrabbling whisper. They emerged, blinking, into the bruised purple light of twilight. They were on the opposite side of the massive salt dome from their entrance. Below, perhaps half a mile out on the flat pan, she saw 3 figures and the outline of a mule. One man was gesturing wildly toward the very formation they were hiding on. Silas Rook's thin silhouette was unmistakable. They have seen the tracks leading in, Kolenya murmured, his mouth close to her ear. His breath was warm against the chilling air. They will find the hole. We must be gone. But the cave. The bones. The cave is protected by its own secret. And by this. He opened his leather apron, revealing not tools, but several carefully wrapped packets. He lit a short fuse with his flint. A gift from my Welsh father's trade. Blasting powder. He hurled the packet in a high arc. It landed not at the entrance, but partway up the sloping salt face above it. The explosion was a stunning concussive whump that echoed across the wastes. A wall of white dust bloomed, and with a great grinding roar, a new slide of salt cascaded down, completely obliterating the entrance they had carved. Through the settling dust, they heard distant, furious shouts. That will not stop them forever, Kolenya said, pulling her down a hidden gully. But it will make them think the mountain is angry, and it buys us time. Now we run, not back to the river, but north, into the deeper wastes. Elara ran, the box of plates heavy in her arms, her lungs burning with cold, salty air. She was no longer a hired agent on a grim errand. She was a fugitive, an accomplice. The weight she carried was no longer just glass and silver nitrate. It was the memory of a world stolen from thieves, entrusted to her by a man with golden eyes who had just declared a silent war to protect it. The vast, white emptiness ahead was no longer just a wasteland. It was their only sanctuary. They ran until the world was a monochrome blur of white and deepening indigo, until Elara's lungs felt shredded by the crystal dust air and the weight of the plate box was a fire in her arms. Only when the stars pricked the sky with icy, indifferent brilliance did Kolenya slow, pulling her into the lee of a wind-sculpted salt hoodoo that rose like a frozen wave. Here, he rasped, his own breath coming hard. We rest. They will not follow in the dark. The wastes are hungry at night for those who do not know their paths. Elara sank to the ground, her back against the cool salt, clutching the box to her chest as if it were a child. The adrenaline seeped away, leaving her trembling with cold and delayed shock. In the starlight, Kolenya's face was a stark mask of concentration. He shrugged off his pack and leather apron, retrieving a small, grease-paper parcel. He unwrapped 2 strips of pemmican and handed her one. Eat. Your body is in flight. It needs fuel, not fear. She forced herself to chew the dense, salty mixture. Will they dig through the slide? Maybe, he said, his golden eyes scanning the horizon behind them. But they are cowards and hired hands. The blast, the collapsing mountain, it will sow doubt. They will fear a curse or that we are buried inside. It will slow them. We have a night, perhaps a day. He took a long drink from his canteen and passed it to her. The water was warm and metallic, but it was life. Where are we going? She asked, her voice small in the immense silence. North. To a place the maps do not have. A place even the old ones avoided. The Glass Lake. The name sent a fresh shiver through her. A lake? Here? Not water, he said, his voice dropping as if the very words needed care. A lake of time. A sheet of obsidian, black as a void, smoother than a mirror, laid over a mile of the pan. It is where the sky fell and melted the earth long ago. It shows other things. He offered no further explanation. They spent the night in a tense, shared watchfulness, huddled together for warmth against the biting cold that poured from the stars. Elara dozed fitfully, her dreams a jumble of falling bones and Silas Rook's laughter echoing in a crystal cathedral dot at first light. They moved again. The landscape grew even more alien. The salt crust gave way to patches of jagged, volcanic rock and fields of pumice that crunched underfoot. The air grew thinner, sharper. Around midday, Kolenya stopped and pointed. Ahead, the white and gray plains simply ended. In its place was a perfect, unbroken sheet of profound, liquid-looking black. It stretched to the horizon, a shocking anomaly. The obsidian was flawlessly smooth, reflecting the scudding clouds and the pale sun with a clarity that was disorienting. It was a lake of solid night, the Glass Lake, Kolenya whispered. Walk softly. Do not look directly at your feet for long. It shows you what is and what might have been. They stepped onto the surface. It was like walking on a black, frozen river. Their footsteps were eerily silent. Elara made the mistake of glancing down. She saw her own reflection, a dust-streaked, wide-eyed woman clinging to a box, but superimposed over it were faint, ghostly images. For a fleeting second, she saw herself in a sunlit parlor, a child on her knee, a man's hand, not her husband's, on her shoulder. The image vanished, replaced by another, her own face, older, harder, aiming a rifle from a canyon rim. She gasped and looked up, her heart hammering. It plays tricks, Kolenya said, not looking at her. He was staring ahead, his own reflection walking beside a dozen other, fainter ones, warriors in older dress, a woman in a patterned dress, a child with his same golden eyes. His jaw was clenched. It shows paths not taken, spirits of the land, echoes. It is not for the weak of heart. They were halfway across the impossible expanse when the first shot rang out. It was a flat, distant crack, but on the glass-smooth surface, the sound skated towards them with unnatural speed. A chip of obsidian erupted 10 feet to their right. Elara spun. At the far edge of the lake, where they had entered, 3 figures had emerged. Silas Rook and the 2 hulking men from the saloon. One was reloading a long-range buffalo rifle. He is more stubborn than I credited, Kolenya growled. Run. Do not run in a straight line. They broke into a desperate, zigzagging sprint. Another shot whined past, shattering the perfect reflection of a cloud. Running on the glass was treacherous. It offered no purchase. Elara slipped, the plate box flying from her hands. She cried out, not for herself, but for the fragile glass inside. The box skidded, but did not open. Kolenya didn't hesitate. He scooped up the box with one hand and hauled her to her feet with the other. Leave it, she cried, thinking of their pursuers. No, he said, his voice iron. This is the trade. This is the memory. It is worth more than our breath. They reached the far side of the Glass Lake, scrambling onto rough, volcanic scree. The obsidian had given them some distance. Their pursuers were still crossing the open mirror-like plain, easy targets. Kolenya shoved Elara behind a large boulder and set the plate box down. He unslung his long rifle. "What are you doing?" "Buying time," he said, his voice chillingly calm. He settled into a prone position, the octagonal barrel resting on the rock. He took a slow, deep breath, his golden eye closing for a second as he judged the windless air across the glass. The rifle spoke a sharper, cleaner report than the buffalo gun. On the lake, one of the hired men let out a yelp and stumbled, clutching his leg. Kolenya had aimed to wound, not kill. A warning dot. It worked. The three figures dove for cover behind a slight ridge on the obsidian plain. The return fire became sporadic, wild. Kolenya fired twice more, his shots pinging off the glass near their hiding spot, keeping them pinned. "Now," he said, rising, "while they are frightened of the mirror and the bullet. This way." He led her into a labyrinth of black basalt columns, a forest of stone. The air grew warmer. She could smell sulfur. The ground trembled faintly underfoot. They climbed a steep, ashy slope, and at the crest, Elara stopped. Stunned. Before them was a narrow valley, steamy and verdant, a blister of life in the mineral deadland. A hot spring bubbled at its heart, feeding a small, turquoise pool surrounded by hardy green reeds and a few stunted, brave willows. The contrast was violently beautiful. The spring is bitter, laced with minerals, but it is water, Kolenya said, leading her down. And the steam and the rock will hide our heat from any tracker's glass. We can defend this place. They drank deeply from a runoff stream, the water warm and tasting of metal and earth. Elara finally let herself slump against a sun-warmed basalt column, the exhaustion total. Kolenya carefully inspected the plate box, nodding in satisfaction that it was intact. He then began to make a defensive circuit of the small valley. As the afternoon waned, the reality of their situation settled on her. They won't stop, will they? Rook, even if we give him the plates. Kolenya sat across from her, cleaning his rifle with a practiced ease. No, he has been humiliated. He has been shot at. And he knows now that what we have is of immense, peculiar value. He will not stop. He will wait on the edge of the glass lake, or he will find a way around. He has water and stubbornness. Then what? Desolation crept into her voice. We can't stay here forever. He looked at her, the setting sun catching in his eyes, making them truly seem like molten gold. There is another way. Not back to the world of men. Forward into the heart of the wastes. There is a place my mother's people spoke of in whispers. A trading post, but not for goods. For knowledge. A place where a few of the Endu refused the reservations, and others like them, mountain men, desert rats, scholars gone native meat. They would value the plates. They would protect them. And us, a myth? She said, but without conviction. Is this a myth? He gestured to the hidden valley, to the obsidian lake beyond the ridge. Is the bone cathedral a myth? Your world draws its maps too small, Elara Vance. Her name on his lips, here in this impossible place, felt like an anchor. Why would you take me there? I am. Of that other world. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the gentle plop of the spring. Because you did not see trinkets in the bones. You saw a story, and you ran to protect it, not your own skin. The trade is complete. But the path is now shared. He looked away, a rare vulnerability in his profile. And because on the glass lake I saw an echo of you, standing beside me, not behind me, in a place that was not dying. The confession hung in the steamy air, more intimate than a touch. Elara felt the last wall around her own guarded heart crumble. It wasn't just the danger or the shared purpose. It was the recognition, soul deep and mirrored in a black lake, that they were the same kind of exile. As full dark fell. She heard it first, a distant rhythmic crunching on the scree slope above their valley. Too steady for an animal. Kolenya heard it too. In an instant, he was on his feet, rifle ready. He pulled her up and pushed her towards the deepest cluster of reeds by the hot pool. Stay. Do not move. Do not speak. He melted into the shadows of the basalt columns. Elara crouched in the hot, damp darkness, the plate box at her feet. She heard a low curse from the ridge, then Silas Rook's voice, thin with strain and fury. I know you're down there, witch. And you're savage. You think you can steal from me? You think you can hide in a hole? A shot rang out, ricocheting off rock. Then a different sound. A low, pained grunt. A scuffle. A choked-off cry that was unmistakably Rook's. Then silence. Minutes stretched like hours. Elara's hand closed around a heavy, smooth stone from the spring's edge. A figure appeared at the edge of the reeds. She raised the stone. It was Kolenya. He had a fresh, bleeding gash on his temple, and his knuckles were raw. In his hand, he held Silas Rook's derringer. He tossed it into the hot spring. He was alone. The others, the wounded one and his friend, turned back at the glass lake. They had enough. He knelt before her, his breath coming quick. He will not trouble us again. The wastes have taken him. He didn't elaborate. She didn't need him to. The finality in his voice was absolute. The immediate threat was gone. But as Elara looked at Kolenya's weary, resolute face in the starlight, she knew the true journey was just beginning. They were not just fleeing from something now. They were journeying towards a possibility, a secret place at the heart of the white nothing, carrying the fragile, luminous memory of a cathedral made of salt and bone. And for the first time since her husband's death, the path ahead, however perilous, did not feel empty. It felt shared. They buried Silas Rook in a shallow, unmarked scrape in the ashy soil at the valley's edge. Kolenya performed no rite. The man had forfeited his story. The hot spring valley, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb with a fresh ghost. At first light, they filled every canteen with the mineral bitter water and climbed out of the steam and green. Back into the stark, consuming whiteness, Kolenya's head wound had crusted overnight, a dark, angry line against his temple. He moved with a slight stiffness, but his determination was a palpable force. He carried the precious box of glass plates in his pack now, a sacred burden. Elara carried the empty camera case, its lightness a strange counterpoint to the heaviness in her spirit. They walked north, the rising sun at their backs, their long shadows preceding them like scouts into the unknown. For 2 days, the wastes offered no solace, only variation on a theme of austerity. They crossed a plain of gypsum so fine it felt like walking on moon dust, then a field of jagged black lava rock that tore at their boots. Kolenya navigated by a secret cartography, the tilt of a wind-sculpted hoodoo, the color of the salt crust, the distant, shimmering shape of a mesa only he could recognize. Their conversation was sparse, functional, yet the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers or a business arrangement, but the deep, knowing quiet of shared trial. On the morning of the 3rd day, Elara saw it first, a thin, dark seam on the horizon that wasn't a rock formation. As they drew closer, it resolved into a line of staggering, impossible green. Cottonwoods, real and towering, their leaves a defiant shout of emerald against the monochrome world. And beneath them, the glint of true, fresh water, a slow, clear river emerging from a crack in a low sandstone cliff and vanishing into another miles downstream. The hidden river, Kolenya said, a note of profound relief softening his graveled voice for the first time since the fight. It runs for 10 miles above ground before it goes back to the deep stone. It is the lifeline. Nestled in the grove where the river emerged were signs of human habitation, but not of any town Elara had ever known. There were 3 low, solid adobe structures built partly into the cliff face, their roofs made of layered sod and river cane. A corral held a few tough-looking mustangs. Smoke curled from a chimney pipe made of stacked tin cans. And scattered around were signs of a dozen different lives: a weathered tippy frame, a canvas wall tent patched with hides, a half-finished dugout canoe turned upside down on sawhorses. A man stepped out of the largest adobe. He was ancient, his skin like old saddle leather, his white hair braided with strips of red cloth. He wore a union suit and a bison robe and held a long-stemmed pipe. His eyes, sharp and black as obsidian chips, fixed on them. "Kolenya can't see," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "The wind said you were coming, and you bring a shadow from the outside world." His gaze shifted to Elara, assessing but not hostile. "Grandfather," Kolenya replied, using the term of respect. "This is Elara Vance. She carries the memory of the Salt Cathedral. We seek the table." The old man, who later introduced himself as simply Thomas, nodded slowly. "The table is for all who come in good faith with something to share and nothing to steal. You have been tested. I see it on you. Come, drink, then we will speak." The community, they learned, was called Ba-Si-Ni, the Gathering. It was home to 15 souls. A few elderly Apache like Thomas who had refused the long walk to San Carlos. A one-eyed former cavalry scout named Millens who now spoke more to his bureau than to people. A botanist from Harvard who'd come to study the unique flora and never left. A Mexican leatherworker and a family of Paiute who came and went with the seasons. It was a place of taciturn acceptance, where a person's past was their own business. But their present actions were the only currency that mattered. That evening, after a meal of stewed rabbit and wild onions, the community gathered in the largest adobe around a massive, scarred table of salvaged railway iron set on stone supports. The table, by the light of clay oil lamps, Kolenya told the story of the Bone Cathedral, of Rook's greed, of the flight across the glass lake. He spoke not with boastful drama, but with the solemn cadence of a history keeper. Then Elara opened the box. One by one, by the lamplight, she held up the glass plates. She had no projector, but the lamplight shining through the negative images cast faint, ghostly positives onto the whitewashed adobe wall. The silent assembly watched as the mammoth tusk arches, the spiral of bison skulls, the delicate lattice of ribs, and the central storyteller skeleton materialized like specters in the room. A collective, reverent hush fell. Thomas reached out a trembling hand as if to touch the image of the storyteller. "My father's father spoke of this place," he whispered. "He called it the Dreamer's Tomb. We thought it lost. You have brought its soul back to us." The botanist, a man called Linnaeus, adjusted his wire-frame glasses, his eyes wide. "The archaeological significance. It's beyond priceless. These plates, they must be preserved." "That is why we are here," Kolenya said. "To preserve, not to sell, to keep safe." A council was held. It was decided unanimously. A dry, cool storage niche would be carved into the cliff behind Thomas's dwelling, lined with cedar planks from an ancient stash. The plates would be stored there, along with any written accounts Linnaeus and Thomas could produce to interpret the patterns. They would become the core of Ba-Si-Ni's own library. A treasure for the people of the Indash between Dot. As the meeting broke up, Thomas took Kolenya and Elara aside. "You have paid the price of entry with your burden," he said to Elara. Then he looked at Kolenya. "But a man cannot live only on the memory of the past, nor a woman only on the fear of the outside. The heart of the wastes is not a hiding place. It is a hearth. Will you tend it? Kolenya looked at Elara, a question in his golden eyes that contained all the unspoken words of their brutal, shared journey. Elara thought of her boarded-up life in a town that had forgotten her, of the cold rooms and colder commissions. She looked around at the ruffian sanctuary, at the people who asked for no history, only honest work. She thought of the plates, safe now, their story continuing. And she looked at Kolenya, the man who had shown her that maps could be drawn in salt and memory, and that a path shared was a path made bearable, even beautiful. I have a skill, she said, her voice clear in the quiet room. I can document, not just bones. I can map this river, this grove. I can make portraits for those who want them. I can help Linnaeus catalog the plants. I can tend the hearth. Thomas nodded, a slow smile cracking his weathered face. Then the empty dwelling by the canoe, it is yours. The roof needs work. The man from the east who built it heard a different wind calling last year. The next weeks were a baptism of sweat and purpose. They repaired the small adobe, chinking cracks with river clay. Elara used the last of her chemistry to develop a final set of prints from the plates, which they framed in whittled cottonwood and hung in the main hall. She started a new project, a series of portraits of the people of Bassi-Ni. Mullen sat stiffly with his bureau. Thomas held his pipe with regal dignity. The Paiute children grinned with gap-toothed joy. Kolenya taught her how to set snares, how to find the edible tubers that grew near the hot springs, how to read the warnings in the sky. She taught him how to write labels in precise script, how the camera's lens worked, the Latin names for the sage and saltwort. Their partnership, forged in survival, deepened into a quiet, effortless synergy. One evening, months later, they sat by the hidden river, watching the sunset paint the cottonwoods in fire. The plate box was safe in its niche. Their home was sturdy, their place in the community earned. On the glass lake, Elara said softly, not looking at him. You said you saw an echo of me, standing beside you. He was quiet for a moment, watching the water. I did, but it was faint. A might have been. He turned to her, the last light catching in his eyes. This is not an echo. This is the true shape of the thing. He didn't reach for her hand. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze was everything. The shared terror of the blast, the awe in the cathedral, the desperate run across the black mirror, the peace of the work-worn days that followed. It was an offering more intimate than any touch. Elara felt the last remnant of the woman from the ghost boat saloon, the professional widow, dissolve into the river's gentle murmur. Here was a man who knew the weight of her past and had shown her a future, not in spite of it, but woven through with it. Yes, she said, the word of vow exhaled into the cooling air. This is the true shape. He leaned forward then, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of stolen passion, but of profound arrival. It tasted of river water and wood smoke, of salt and resilience, of a long journey ended and a longer one together begun. The white waste still stretched, implacable and immense, beyond their green grove. The world of men and its greed still turned far to the east and west, but in the heart of the nothing they had found a everything. Elara Vance, the death photographer, had finally developed a picture of her own life, not a frozen record of what was lost, but a living, breathing image of what had been found, a purpose, a people, and a love as enduring and uniquely formed as the crystals in a salt cathedral, born from pressure, time, and the relentless, surprising will of the human heart to make a home.